Delighted to have so many attendees once again to our webinar series. This is the third. But first, a bit about us. As Rebecca said, I'm the founding principal of LEES+Associates. The group of folks you see here is, most of our group, we're missing one or two here, but we're all landscape architects and planners and business planners. And this is what we do. We plan and design cemeteries, and have decided in the last 8 months to roll out some of our experience and share that with as many of you as care to participate. And that's our goal over the next year or so. We will do at least 2, maybe even 3 more of these through a variety of different portals. The first one we did was on cemetery trends. That was also very well attended. The second one on green burial. And today's session is on cemetery master planning. All of these are posted on our YouTube site, and happy to share the link to that, but also easily found under LEES+Associates. For further review and consideration. If there's any questions from any of those that you have upon viewing them, don't ever hesitate to give us a call, give us an email, text us. So this morning we'll talk about cemetery master planning. What is a master plan? And this, to a certain extent, is kind of landscape planning 101. We'll be introducing some terms here you may not be familiar with. And of course, as Rebecca said, if you have any questions at all about the language we're using or the concepts we're bringing up, then that's what the Q&A is for. So don't let me gloss over language that you're not familiar with. But this is all about cemetery master planning. There is some jargon involved. We'll talk about some of the key considerations that you need to take into account as you're preparing for and ultimately executing a cemetery master plan. Brief question and answer period with some discussion. And then we'll talk about some of the tools that are commonly used. We won't go through the whole toolbox, but some of the more obvious ones. And close with some action plans. Once you have a master plan, then what? What should some of the concluding calls to action be in a master plan? And then we'll have ample time for questions and discussion as well at the close. So what is a master plan? I guess maybe to a certain degree it'd be helpful to say what a master plan is not. A master plan is not something you would typically build from, although there should be ample inspiration as to what could be built. But a master plan does not include dimensions, for example. A master plan does not include specific materials, although a palette may be offered or suggested. So you wouldn't be able to take a master plan necessarily and give it to a contractor or one of your staff. Some of the smaller scale master plans, like for a cremation garden or a scattering garden, sure, there's probably sufficient inspiration and information there to be able to build from. But on the whole, a master plan lays out a vision, lays out a path forward, and is a framework for decision making for you, your staff, and your board, depending on the governance model that you have. It is a fairly high level. You'll see from the examples here, if you we talk about like a 5,000 foot level, you're zooming in and out from that level. Whereas, for example, design development is down to the specifics. So a master plan usually comes somewhere after a feasibility study. And so for those of you that already have a cemetery, you know there's a market there, you know that the land you've selected is feasible, that the geotechnical considerations and the water and the drainage and the hydrology, the proximity to transit and distance from other inappropriate uses, that's all been sorted out, or in large part has. And even before that, a strategic plan where you may, in some communities that we've worked in, many, in fact, the council, the board is asking, well, should we be doing this at all? Is this a service that we should be involved with? Then comes a feasibility. Is there a market? Is there the land? If there is a market, how much of a market? Is it a viable business unit? This is often where the business case analysis would occur, is in the feasibility stage. And then we look at a master plan, which is inherently spatial. In other words, we're looking at the geography. We're considering the real estate. And we're considering the change of elevation and the topographic characteristics, the vegetation characteristics. So these are biophysical considerations. Now there are master plans that are what we call comprehensive, and those are the ones that are include both the spatial considerations, but also the business considerations. What are the products and services being offered? What are they being offered at? What will the anticipated uptake be? And those are based on demographics, as well as an assessment of the total available market, and then projections as to how many people would be using your cemetery. We're going to actually be preparing a webinar specifically on cemetery business planning. But for today's webinar, we're going to be talking about the physical plan. Comprehensive plan brings both together. A business plan is just that, looks at the finances and market, and today we'll talk about the physical side. Following on a master plan is what's known in the design world as design development, and ultimately detailed design. This is where the dimensions for the pathway, the specific dimensions of the grave layout are specified if you don't already have some, or maybe you're going to change them. The specific dimensions of any building, the footprints of a works yard, the height and shape of any ground contouring, the materials specifically. So whereas in the master plan, we'll show examples of different types of granite, in design development and detailed design, we will actually specify granite 635 from this or that supplier. So these are documents that can be built from. These are documents you can take to the contractors and get pricing on and expect them to be accurate. And of course, as you move from master planning through design development, detailed design, the quality of the cost estimation and the accuracy of those estimates increases at each go. So for example, in the master plan stage, the budget allowances, which we'll talk about later, are plus or minus 25 to 30%. Maybe even more in some cases. But as you move through and refine the design, not surprisingly, the level of accuracy for costing increases down to 10% and then 5%. And usually you carry an allowance of a contingency of about 5% because you just can't cover off every eventuality. And of course, the master plan looks at opportunities and constraints. We're going to talk more about that in a few moments. But ultimately, whether you're doing the work in-house or you're hiring a firm like ours, the goal is to inventory all of the different opportunities that your community or your business area is facing, and what are the constraints? What are the visual issues? Is there a high rise nearby that you want to block out in order to make the place more meaningful? Are there drainage issues? Are there other issues that need to be dealt with? I'll talk about more of that in a minute. And then ultimately, of course, you build the thing, and it gets commissioned, and there's a ribbon cutting, and you begin to serve the community. We'll talk some more a little later on about how often a master plan should be done. I've already had a really good question on that so far. When we're doing this kind of work, cemetery master planning, one of the devices that we found to be very effective in breaking the task down into different component parts is to consider them as layers. This is a common planning device for all kinds of different urban and landscape planning. But one of the most important in a cemetery is what we call circulation, and that is the way in which people and equipment move through the property. And there should be a hierarchy of circulation. One of the most important ones, of course, in a cemetery is how does the funeral entourage enter into and leave the property? What happens when there's more than one service going on at the same time? Parking is usually a consideration in circulation. Come back to the parking aspect in a minute. But the safe movement of people in and through a cemetery is important because there can oftentimes be many cars. You want the coach to get as close to the burial site as possible. You want the elderly members of the family to get as close to the gravesite as possible. And if there was, say, a medical calamity, how do emergency vehicles get in and out of the cemetery? So in some cases, there is actually an emergency gate that is opened only for that purpose. The next layer of circulation is the movement of operational vehicles and equipment. How does the backhoe get to the gravesite without disturbing graves or headstones, ideally, although many of you will know sometimes that just has to happen. But there should be some real thought put into not only the one-time event of a backhoe getting to a gravesite, opening it and closing it, but what happens over time? Is the ground eroded because the same path is used? Is the cemetery laid out in such a way that you work your way out of a corner, or is there a lot of pre-need graves that you may have to get back to over a course of 30, 40, 50 years, maybe even more than that? The next level of circulation is the pedestrian circulation. Ideally, cemeteries should have ways to effectively and enjoyably walk through the site, whether that's for, as we've talked about in previous webinars, passive recreation and enjoying the landscape, or to grieve the loss of a friend or family member. Sometimes active transportation, certainly to a cemetery, is considered, and even through a cemetery. The next layer that we look at is really kind of rolled into one. One is the interment layer and memorialization, vegetation, wayfinding, operations. Wayfinding is an interesting one because that's where the signage and even the non-signage organization of the cemetery is laid out so that people can get to a grave site without troubling staff or having to go online. The landscape character is an important aspect. We'll talk about that in the operations and constraints. And then what are the biophysical, what are the vegetation and soil considerations that need to be taken into account? So here are a few examples of what I've just said. You can see with the different color of lines and weight of lines, the hierarchy I was referring to. So the blue being the main procession access routes into the cemetery, the turquoise being additional access to the burial grounds, the orange being the pedestrian routes, and the mauve in this case is an active transportation route around the edge of Sparwood Cemetery. This diagram also starts to set up a hierarchy of nodes or interesting viewpoints or axes in the site, and obviously the circulation should link into those, if not directly, then indirectly. This is an example of the interment zoning. The green areas are the prime traditional in-ground burial areas. The mauve would be areas where cremation gardens occur in concentrated components, and then the orange would be more future infill, with the peach color, I guess, potential green burial areas. So you can see, managers and decision makers can see at a glance where all the different interment options are going to be. Oftentimes there will be a similar layer that shows where the upright markers will be. So what we call the memorialization layer. Where will the flat markers be? Will there be a scattering garden? And one of the things you may notice in a plan like this is that the cremated remains interment options are thoroughly integrated with the site plan. If there's one takeaway that we're going to leave you with today, it's the idea that there should be places for family members who choose cremation and maybe others that want to be buried in the ground to be buried relatively nearby, so that in the not too distant past, we would have created a cremation garden off in the corner somewhere. Of course, with the advent of cremation, as we've talked about previously, that more and more people are choosing cremation, although still not that many bringing their cremated remains to a cemetery. So we want to encourage that to happen. And in order to encourage that and serve the families properly, we want to provide those cremated remains interment options integral to the layout of the cemetery as a whole. And this is an example of a master plan that is nearing its final stages. The nodes are clear. The diagrammatic arrangement of pathways has now been firmed up with actual road widths here, and the layer of showing where trees would be placed, in this case in combination of formal and informal, is starting to take place, and viewpoints are now shown as well. So sometimes called the amenity layer. Viewpoints would be part of an amenity layer. So with that overview of what a master plan would include, I didn't speak a whole lot about operations, but that is a critical issue, that we always want to ensure that there is sufficient room not only to get in and around the graves, but where is the additional soil overburden stored? Where is the works yard? And if it's a large cemetery expansion, is it convenient to the staff? This, of course, has significant impacts on efficiency. And we'll talk some more about operations in a sec. But one of the other critical issues that we've seen a lot over the last 22 years in practice is the need to really optimize the space in a cemetery. And because most of our work has been for the public sector, we make the distinction between optimization and maximization. We try to ensure that every cemetery master plan leads to a meaningful landscape. Maximizing every square meter of landscape can lead to a very dense and not as meaningful a layout and experience for families and visitors. So we talk about optimization, and part of optimization is the concept of infilling. One of the other important concepts is diversification, ensuring that all members of the community are welcome and have places to inter and memorialize. And of course, you want to make sure that the site is safe, and that in places where there are grades or water, that those have been addressed in the master plan. These are just some of the critical issues that in the time available today we'll talk about. So this is a watercolor rendering by Lila Zeppelin in our office that represents work that our firm did with PFS Studio, going on 15, 16 years ago now, where the city of Vancouver asked us to look at ways in which the redundant roads in their cemetery could be used for creation of cremated remains interment options. This is a cemetery that is going on 140 years old. It was basically closed in the late 80s, long before cremated remains were coming back to cemeteries, and was frankly on its last legs financially. But with the advent of cremation and some inspired leadership, the idea of infilling on roads that were no longer needed to bring a coach up close to the gravesite came to fruition. And so you can see here inside of just over an acre, 2,100 sets of cremated remains interment options can be accommodated, and many more than that if some of them have more than one set of remains. And this has been hugely successful and has helped fund significant other improvements at Mountain View Cemetery. Here are a couple examples of what that infill looked like. So it's not hard to imagine these long pathways, now pathways, but once roads, have been used, along with the identification of some existing pathway ends where these family columbaria and family vessels could be located, working with the natural trees, and a real sense of place has emerged using materials that were sympathetic to the historic landscape. One may argue the most historic landscape in Vancouver. So I think an excellent example of optimizing capacity and infill. One of the other key aspects of cemetery master planning that really has to be taken into account in this era is the accommodation of graves for those of the Muslim faith. These are particular in that the alignment to the sacred Qibla stone in Mecca is imperative. And this is one of several examples of accommodating diversity within a cemetery. The Jewish faith, First Nations and American Indians, and those of other faiths that have specific interment and memorialization requirements need to be considered. Years ago, there would be a specific section set aside for the Catholics and the Protestants and the Knights of Pythias and the Masons, and that kind of segregation has long since gone away. But still important to recognize that some phase has some very specific requirements for the way the cemetery is master planned and laid out. The interesting thing here, just as a brief aside, is that you might think that that the orientation of Muslim graves is from at least Western Canada is more or less east southeast. Well, that's not the case. The direction of prayer is actually the polar route, or the shortest route to Mecca, which in the Vancouver, Victoria area of Canada is just 16 degrees off of true north. So that's an extra additional nuance that needs to be considered when laying out Muslim graves in particular. And then there's the issue of biophysical issues, critical issues associated with landslip. And those of you familiar with the ravines in Toronto may recognize this kind of condition where cemeteries have been situated at the edge of a ravine, oftentimes on fill slopes. And lo and behold, over time, the graves start migrating downhill. Gravity does that. And so this image here is an example of a construction drawing image, not a master plan image, but I include it for that distinction first, but also to emphasize the importance of being able to really analyze what's happening using, in most cases at least, geoscientists and geotechnical engineers, so that we're understanding what's happening below the surface. Now, you could take this example and consider cemeteries that are very wet. We know we have participants on the line today who have exactly that condition. For one reason or another, the cemetery is located where the water table is very high. The master plan should address how to deal with that, at least at a strategic level, not necessarily down to the construction drawing stage here, which, although the drawing looks fairly simple, represents months of work and is, given the very tight nature of the landscape, is a real challenge. So a couple examples here, some case studies. So you get a sense of what your master plan end product would look like. In this case, Elk Falls Cemetery, Vancouver Island. The developed part of the cemetery was where my cursor is, off to the left, and the right was pure forest land, as you can see here. Dense second growth, probably second or third growth West Coast forest. So our task was to look at the expansion area, look at how the parking was laid out, and come up with a master plan. Our recommendation was actually to reorient the exit and entry. It was just one exit, operations yard here, ample room for laydown area, secure storage of equipment, ample room for cremated remains interment options, although unfortunately in this plan, this is the existing layout, all of them off to one side, whereas you can see that this area here is the traditional in-ground burial. But then as we move into the developed area, pods for different types of interment options, including green burial. So this shows a combination of the circulation, the biophysical layer, and the interment layer. And really wanted to emphasize the importance of you, your staff, your consultants, being familiar with the site and really understanding what's going on. If you're going to create meaningful place, you have to understand the sense of place. And you can't do that, as good as Zoom and other technologies are, without actually being there, understanding where the wind's coming from, and understanding the context outside of the cemetery boundaries, understanding the nature and makeup of the forest vegetation, and in this case, Patrick Beach, shown here on the left, who's one of the stalwarts on our webinar team, with one of the principals of our company out there, really ensuring that the opportunities and constraints that this site offered were properly inventoried and understood, so that the master plan can reflect that. Another example, cemetery that is just being built now. I'll show you a picture in a moment, in Calgary, where again, significant biophysical constraints and environmental criteria that had to be satisfied for the new cemetery in Southeast Calgary. And I think this is especially helpful because it shows the power of cross sections. So that's what these images are on the right hand side. If you see plans come in from your consultants that do not include cross sections, they are missing the imperative of showing exactly what the experience of that space is going to be like. And that's why you always have people in a cross section, so you can understand the scale, the distance between different elements, and how those representations in 2 dimensions in the plan end up being experienced in the real world. So this is the new central focus area at Southeast Calgary Cemetery. So we've got the master plan image on the left, and then you have the built image on the right. And you can see that the two are not precisely the same, because during design development, construction drawings, things change. The ideas improve. The client and user input increases significantly. And so ultimately, the final plan represents that level of input. Another example from Alberta, Rocky View County, you can see the significant expansion on the lower part of the image on the left, and then zooming in, the image on the right starts to show the arrangement of the buildings. Again, a master plan is not something you build from, but is perfectly legitimate to show the general arrangement of buildings, what type of buildings, their proximity to one another, and then how does the circulation relate to those buildings, and how does it access the burial areas nearby. So this is a more softly rendered, hand-rendered version. All kinds of different styles that many staff and consultants will use. And then Capilano View Cemetery, a site that's near and dear to me, showing how the vegetation is to change over time with more distinct plantings. And you can see the level of detail around the buildings, and the area shown in yellow is quite a bit higher than the rest of the site. That is because that was their primary phase implementation area. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, is what are the key focus areas. You can't do a master plan to the same level of detail across the whole property unless it's rather small. So Capilano View Cemetery, and a couple examples of some of the images that we'll often include in the cemetery master plan, just to give a sense of in this case, how does a below ground crypt work for staff and decision makers that may not be familiar with that. Very important consideration for infill. What might a outdoor celebration space look like? Again, you wouldn't build from these, but it provides some inspiration. Cemetery in Wildomar, California, that actually will not need a significant amount of the expansion land for some time. So one of the things we always look at is how will that land be used on an interim basis before the actual interment and memorialization happens. So in this case, potentially a municipal nursery, some active play, some community garden space can be used for the first 10, 20, 30, 40 years even, until the community needs it. And then the cemetery can expand in that direction. So with that, Rebecca, I think we'll move to the discussion stage and see what folks have in mind.
Yeah, thanks for that, Eric, and thanks everyone for your questions so far. So we have a couple questions here. You went over the master planning process. And this participant is wondering sort of how often should a cemetery develop a master plan? And a bit of a follow-up to that, are there any trigger points that indicate when a master plan should be updated?
Yeah, great question. Master plans usually have a lifespan of 8 to 10, 12 years. After that, some of the initial estimates of use of the cemetery will have changed, in all likelihood will have changed. And so those need to be updated. I'll talk in a minute about demographics and disposition trends, but those need to be revisited. And as well, the level of detail that you can get in a master plan is never going to be spot on for every single eventuality. And so in all likelihood, by the time the master plan is updated, things that have already been changed internally, so those need to be reflected. Yeah. Okay.
Great. So this is another one sort of about timeline. So you mentioned that the process generally starts with the strategic plan. So this participant is wondering what happens before that. How do you prepare yourself for the master planning process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if you're the manager, the property manager, the cemetery manager, maybe you're a counselor, you want to be thinking about, well, how does this cemetery, how should it serve the community? Is this primarily a place of interment and memorialization, or are there other aspects that we've talked about previously, such as some of the social benefits of cemeteries, passive recreation, environmental benefits, habitat considerations? So beginning to think along those lines is important. Beginning to consider whether or not the cemetery is a business unit that is expected to recover all its costs, that's an important consideration for you. Get your mind wrapped around that. And then just some of the homework. Are your plans and maps up to date? Is there a good aerial photo? With the advent of drones, there's some fantastic high quality aerial photography available now. But maybe some of that stuff is buried in the archives too, as far as the plot layouts go. So assembling that data and assembling some basic information about how many people were buried there last year, or even better, on average over the last 5 or 10 years, how many were pre-need, how many were at need, so that as you and your staff, maybe even consultants, get into it, you've got at least a sense of your own vision. This is your own individual vision of where you're heading. And that way you're off to a running start.
Great. This participant says that they're planning for a cemetery expansion, and they've recently received a lot of interest from the public about natural burials. They're wondering if you can talk about the operation management of these areas, maybe giving examples of any past experiences.
Yeah, well, the first place I would point the participant to is our last webinar on green burials, where some of these questions are answered. And it's a very common question right now because natural burial and green burial is so topical. And that is what's driving many of those on the webinar today, isn't it? Okay, now I see. I better get cracking with natural burial. And oh, by the way, I'm running out of space. So it's, the two things are coinciding. From a master planning standpoint, one of the things that excites us in our company about green burial is the ability to use marginal areas. the edges of the cemetery where you may not want or be able to accommodate other types of interment options, areas that are ecologically sensitive and that you can bury in and amongst trees and near riparian zones, so without disturbing or compromising them. So from an expansion standpoint, those are some of the things that really need to be considered. Keeping in mind as well, natural burial is still very new, and there's only but a fraction of a percent of people who choose cremation or in-ground burial that are choosing natural burial. So you still need to plan for all those other options.
Great. That just reminds me, all of our previous webinars are on YouTube, so I can post a link to those in the chat. You can check that out. Maybe I'll just ask one more question before we move on to the second segment. So this participant is wondering what is the biggest challenge of going from the master planning phase to the implementation phase?
Yeah, that's a challenge. And it really comes down to funding, frankly, because there's all these wonderful visions, starting with a big vision and then drilling down to the master plan. Everyone's excited. Oh, guess what? It's going to cost us, $100,000 to do that cremation garden. So, that's one of the bigger challenges. Hopefully the master plan, a good master planning process actually builds enthusiasm across the organization. And this is why, we'll talk about consultation in a moment, it's so important that people from finance, engineering, planning, the political side of your organization are at least consulted, if not involved. Because as we like to say, everyone catches the bug eventually. And a good master planning process will see that enthusiasm built across the organization. So when it comes to budget time, people will say, yeah, we saw some great stuff in our cemetery 101 or our cemetery workshop that we had with the cemetery staff. And yeah, let's fund that. Let's make that our priority. The other thing is being very candid with decision makers. You do not want Mr. Smith at City Hall doors with no place to bury his spouse. Mm-hmm. That is happening. Across North America, there is a dearth of cemetery space. You don't want to be caught without a plan.
Great. I think that's a good segue, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Planning makes perfect. Is that what you called this session?
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Rebecca. Some of the tools you've heard me refer to opportunities and constraints a number of times. Really important that those be properly understood, along with engagement, some mapping and some visualizations, and the demographic trends. So we'll move through these fairly quickly. An opportunities and constraints diagram. I had an old prof that referred to them as a yup diagram. You put it up on the wall and everyone sits back and says, yup, that's the way it is. You've captured the views, you've captured the circulation issues, you've captured the geotechnical issues. Typically opportunities and constraints relate again to the physical environment, not so much the business side. And so, is the entrance visible? Is it safe to get in and out? Are there areas that perhaps underutilized or not used at all that could be used for expanding the interment options? That's you'll see this if you're talking to your planning or your design staff or you're bringing a consultant on board. One of the first things that's done is an opportunities and constraints analysis. Sometimes called a SWOT analysis, although we tend to, in physical planning terms, prefer opportunities and constraints. One of the other key aspects is engagement. I spoke about this a moment ago. Whether it's identifying remote cemetery sites with First Nations, as we did up in the Wood Buffalo area, or whether it's talking to the finance folks and folks from engineering and planning. It's imperative that there be enough information gathered, and not every process can involve everyone, of course, but important that there be enough information gathered outside of the cemetery services team so that you're not only building that ownership that I spoke of, but you're getting other inputs as to what should be considered. Sometimes what happens at this stage is there's a bit of a course correction, and the finance director says, well, wait a minute, we've been losing a lot of money here. I really want this thing to recover money, or recover our costs. And so, okay, that's pretty clear. Master plan better accommodate that in some manner. The other group that is often missed is the funeral homes and the funeral directors. Professionals in our society that do not get nearly enough credit for the great work they do. But they are the first stop for a family. They're the first call that a family makes. And funeral directors usually understand the cemetery in ways that no other group of stakeholders does. They need to be consulted. The Legion, the veterans, First Nations, of course, all of the various religious groups that have a handle or a stake in the cemetery should be consulted in one way or the other. Now, that may just be an interview. It may be a survey. It doesn't have to be a significant amount of time spent, but really important that there be adequate consultation. And when I talk about the cemetery services group, also imperative that those on the front line, those that are digging the graves, those that are cutting the grass, cutting the hedges, the men and women at the front counter, how is that customer service experience for them? What can they tell us about what needs to change at the cemetery? One of the other tools that's increasingly powerful and it's come into its own in the last number of years is the ability to map every single grave. And we've mapped literally millions of individual grave plots over the last 20 years. Seeing the pattern of those grave plots, the difference in the patterns across a large site, the difference in sizes of the graves, it tells a lot to the experienced eye as to what's been happening at the cemetery. And then, of course, as the new master plan is unveiled, every single plot should be mapped and inventoried, not only to meet provincial and state federal requirements for unique grave marking, but so that families can see quite clearly what's available. If you're selling pre-need, what's available. And for genealogical societies, what is not only what's available, but who has been buried where and when. So that's a whole other aspect of cemetery operations we can get into at another time, but really an important tool in the master planning process, understanding how the specific maps will be expressed. The other key component is with respect to demographics. And as I said at the beginning, a cemetery master plan, unless it's a comprehensive master plan that includes business case analysis, does not have a lot of pricing in it or market analysis or marketing built into it. However, it's imperative that the trends of the demographic trends in the community are understood, as well as time and available data permit. So an example is this image here, where in the solid dark gray, mauve color, the increasing population as measured in the axis on the left. So community of 33,000 is expected to rise up to a community of almost 38,000 over time. Well, guess what? As the community population increases, so does the death rate. In general, the number of deaths increases. That may change if the population is projected to be lower in age. But on the whole, with the demise of the baby boomers, the population will reflect an increasing death rate. And then what's interesting to understand is, what are the disposition choices? How many people are choosing cremation and how many people are choosing in-ground burial? Of course, in most places in the world, those are the two primary forms of disposition. What do we do with a cadaver once the person has died? There are other alternate forms such as promesa or alkaline hydrolysis or recompose, and others that are coming. But those are at this point still very, very small numbers. So a master plan needs to accommodate the in-ground burial, traditional burial, as well as the interment of cremated remains. As I said, of all those that choose cremation as their disposition, only 20% of those cremated remains are find their way back to a cemetery. At least that's been the trend over the last 10 years or so. So what this means, and critically from a master planning standpoint, is that the primary driver for the master plan ends up being the traditional in-ground burial or natural burial. Those are that's the interment option. Those are the interment options that consume the most ground, the most real estate. And so as a cemetery expansion is occurring, or even a new cemetery is being considered, you need to really look very closely at the number of people that are burying in the ground. Cremated remains can be interred in much denser fashion in cremation gardens, and a whole host of other interment options. So those are the primary drivers, data drivers that you need to consider. There are many others from a business side of things, but we'll leave that for another day. Population growth, number of deaths, disposition trends. You need to understand that. And you can start, back to a previous question, gathering that information as you're preparing to embark upon a cemetery master plan. Now, I did mention cremation gardens, and from time to time, a master plan for a cremation garden is developed. And of course, because cremated remains are much smaller than a casket, the scale and the level of nuance and detail in a cremation garden master plan is going to be much higher. So, just by way of concluding what would be in a master plan, it's imperative that the priorities be clear. And that's why those conversations during consultations are important. Let's bring forward at the end of the master planning process, what were the key issues? Have they been addressed? If they haven't, you better go back and figure it out. We call this the burning platform. Why is a master plan needed? Are you running out of space? Is natural burial knocking at your door? Are cremated remains and interment options, the inventory of those declining? You need to be sure that the priorities in the master plan reflect a solution, bring forward a solution to those burning issues. There needs to be that mix of interment options and services that I referred to. The nuance of that, whether there's more cremated remains interment options, whether there's more in-ground, whether there's more columbaria, more scattering, more family vessels, those are the finer grain priorities that need to be laid out in this penultimate chapter. And then what are the site recommendations? Are there mature buffer areas that are starting to fall down, maybe even cause hazards that need to be replanted? Was that entry addressed earlier in the work? And Is there a road that's slowly breaking down that needs to be repaved? Are there curbs that are missing or broken? Is the wayfinding signage inadequate? All of the different, every different element in a cemetery has some sort of site ramification. And so it ends up being a fairly lengthy list, ideally grouped in different themes. And the layers that I referred to at the start are excellent themes to clump those various recommendations into. And then there's the budget recommendations, and we're careful to call these budget recommendations, sometimes called cost estimates. These are what, at the master planning stage, we refer to as recommended budget allowances. So you'll note the suitably ambiguous language there, and that's because the level of accuracy is still pretty rough. It's still in that 25 to 30% plus or minus range. So it's important that that be emphasized during the layout of the implementation for council and decision makers. And just as a quick aside, these are not commitments to spend. They are a path forward. They are a framework for decision makers. So that's why budget recommendations are mentioned. Important also to talk about phasing. You don't want to build too much because you don't want too much inventory sitting on the shelf and tying up your capital, but you also don't want to be going into the cemetery every year and making a disturbance. The implementation plan should be timed, usually in 3 to 5 year increments. What's going to happen in the first 3 years? What's going to happen in the next 3 years? There should be some indication of, is this going to be done by consultants, by contractors? Are we going to do this in-house? Are we going to do this out-of-house? Are there specialist contractors that we need to start researching and building partnerships with? And there should always be some low-hanging fruit. What are the immediate next steps? Which goes back to the priorities that I mentioned a moment ago. So I think with that, Rebecca, we've kept these participants for almost their full period of time now. What other questions can we answer in the time available?
Great. So there's a question that relates back to biophysical challenges. So this participant would like to know, how do you deal with different soil conditions? For example, clay with shrink and well characteristics.
Yeah, it's a real challenge, especially when the cemetery is already located on those lands, isn't it? In some cases, there can be a topping of a significant layer that pulls the burial zone up above the water table and introduces some diggable material that isn't so hard to manipulate. Certainly in expansion areas, that can be done. Choosing land that doesn't have significant water table issues. Having said that, there are many cemeteries that pump out before the family arrives. That's a legitimate, not necessarily a pleasant, but a legitimate operational. Capilano View Cemetery, West Vancouver, has a very unique perched water table. Almost impossible to solve that. Even though it's one of the most beautiful cemeteries in British Columbia. But from time to time, in certain zones with blue clay, they have to pump out and then bury quickly. So it's one of the more difficult ones. Ideally, you wouldn't locate the cemetery there.
Yeah, in a perfect world. We have another one here about environmental considerations. So they're wondering, how and when do you incorporate wildlife considerations, including movement corridors, and at what stage do you address invasive species? Okay,
I'll try to remember both of those. The wildlife corridors is a perfect example of the opportunities and constraints. That's the stage at which you bring in, if there are some good maps showing wildlife movement, riparian areas, and in fact, cemeteries are a wonderful land use that allows movement of wildlife through it. So having key nodes or patches on either side, green burial is a great way of integrating the cemetery with those, because habitat enhancement, restoration is a key part of natural burial. And also control of invasive species. Again, during the opportunities and constraints section of your work, is there an issue with an invasive species? Come up with a strategy and deal with it in the master plan. That may mean removing the top foot or two of soil in the case of, say, Japanese knotweed or blackberry. It may mean even some chemical solutions. But keeping on top of that early and identifying the issue early in the master planning process is really important. That's an excellent question.
We just have a couple more here. I realize we're reaching the end of our time.
Well, let's keep going.
But earlier in the first part of the session, you sort of alluded to involving all interested parties in the master planning process, including council. So this participant would like to know how they can convince council or their board to undertake a master plan.
Well, I think that pointing to the dearth of cemetery space, especially in urban cities, explaining to them using the language of a planner. Look, you've made allowance for schools and hospitals and high rises and roads and water treatment plants. Where are the cemeteries? Where are the cemeteries in the official community plan? Where are the cemeteries in the area plan? And that will usually get the attention of senior planners and oftentimes politicians as well. Also, painting the picture of running out of cemetery space is a very compelling argument. And also understanding that it can be anywhere from 3 to 5, or in certain parts of the world, 10 years to get a new cemetery approved. So putting those fires under the decision makers will oftentimes yield at least enough resources to do a strategic plan or a feasibility study.
Yeah, that sort of brings us to our next question, and this is one that we get often. So this participant is wondering how Canadian cemeteries are dealing with facing capacity issues in the cemetery.
Well, in a couple different ways, and some more successfully than others. So the infill strategy, the idea of optimizing cemetery space, it's remarkable how many times we've talked clients out of expanding because we've been able to identify 5 or even 10 years of infill capacity. So now many of the older cemeteries have done several infills already long before we arrived. So it becomes even more difficult at that stage. But there's oftentimes some land available nearby. If not land available in the community or on the edge of an amalgamation zone. I think of Niagara Falls in this respect. They're running out of cemetery land. They have a suite of beautiful cemeteries there. Natural burial is picking up. The manager there identified lands some years ago and now are embarking on a master plan to look more closely at those lands. So it really means a close relationship with the planning department and land acquisitions department to make sure they are thinking that far ahead, because we're not just talking about an acre here in most cases. We're talking about 10, 20, 30, 40 acres that are needed. And then, frankly, I'll be honest, in some cases across the country, the issue of lack of cemetery space is not being adequately addressed. And all the other needs I listed a moment ago are trumping the need for cemetery land. And the crisis has been looming for a while, and as the baby boomers age out, the crisis will become even that much more acute.
Okay. That brings us to the end of the questions. We'll keep the webinar open for a few more minutes here, so feel free to ask any additional questions that you have. Also, as Erik mentioned earlier, always open to receiving emails with questions.
Thank you. And there is a short survey at the end when you close out, right, Rebecca? So
Yes.
we really appreciate your participation and your input. If you can think of other topics that would be helpful as we plan for the next series, please bring those forward to us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.